Thank you very much, Paul, for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here to Aspetar. And as Paul said, I was asked to give a lecture on hamstring injuries and why they are not reducing in elite sports. And coming down to Aspetar and giving a lecture about muscle injuries is humbling, as you can understand, given all of the research that's coming out of Aspetar and researchers affiliated to Aspetar. And not only that, also the aim to be in the forefront of clinical management of muscle injuries and hamstring injuries. You're all participating workshops now on how to deal with muscle injuries and knee injuries and so on. We had a fantastic conference now during the weekend dealing with thigh muscle injuries and all the work that goes into knowledge translation of making all of these clinical guidelines available to colleagues around the world. So congratulations to all of the staff here at Aspetar for the great work that you are doing in this space. So I have no conflict of interest to disclose relevant to this talk. I will, however, disclose that I don't have the perfect answer to the question I was set to discuss here today. I will try to give you the layout on hamstring injuries in elite sports and to see whether they are actually a big problem. And also trying to look at some of the reasons why it may be difficult to prevent injuries or reduce hamstring injuries in elite sports in this particular environment. As Paul mentioned, I'm affiliated to the football research group at Linköping University. Some of these names will be very familiar to you, especially I think Jan Ekstrand, who was here in Aspetar for some time. He speaks very warmly of his stay here in Aspetar, and he says to give my regards to everyone here. The studies that Paul mentioned, the elite club injury studies, we have been running the male study for almost 25 years now. Next year is a 25-year anniversary. And this study includes top clubs from all over Europe who plays in the Champions League. This is financed and coordinated by UEFA, and we in the Football Research Group manage the project. We have gathered quite a lot of injuries in this database, so more than 20,000 injuries from professional male football over 24 seasons. I'm very happy to say that in 2018 we also started the women's elite club injury study, and we are starting to gather some valuable data also from women's elite football. So the first question, are hamstring injuries really a problem in elite sport? Well, if we look at the elite club injury study, the risk of having a muscle injury during the season is almost 40% for these players. Many of them will, of course, have one or maybe two injuries, but as you can see on this graph, we have those players that will have 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 or multiple repeat muscle injuries during the season. And these can be a real challenge to manage in the club. If we look at the epidemiology of injuries in elite male and female football, we can see that hamstring injury is the most common injury on the men's side and also on the women's side. So on the men's side, hamstring injuries represent 18% of all injuries among the clubs, with an incidence of 1.2 per 1,000 hours of play. On the women's side, 12% of all injuries are to the hamstrings, with an incidence of 0.8 injuries per 1,000 hours. So yes, they are a big problem. And if we try to translate that to something that is more easy to understand, if you work as a physio or as a doctor in an elite male club, you can expect 10 players to suffer at least one muscle injury, or 5 players to suffer at least one hamstring injury during a season. And you can expect to treat 18 muscle injuries on average, 8 to the hamstrings. So this is sort of the average situation with time loss injuries in a professional male club involved in the study. And from the sport and from the coach point of view, we want to know this. How does it impact player availability? So the median absence for a hamstrings injury in our study is 13 days, so just about 2 weeks. 15% will be severe with an absence of longer than 4 weeks. If you have a structural injury with muscle fiber tear evident on MRI or ultrasound, the median absence is 17 days, and 20% will have absence more than a month. For functional injuries, it's a shorter median absence, understandable, and very few severe injuries. So you usually can push these injuries a little bit harder in the rehab. If you look at lateral versus medial hamstring injuries, there's no real difference between biceps femoris injuries and semimembranosus and tendinosus injuries in terms of the median absence. Now, looking at time trends of injury rates, this was a study that we published in 2021. And Roald, who is also here, was part of that study. We looked at the injury rates in the Champions League. This is a male study from 2001 until 2019. And we compared that with previously studied data from this cohort. So the 7-year data, the 11-year data, and then the 18-year data. And we can see a steady decline in injury rates overall for match injury incidence and for training injury incidence. If we look a little deeper into these numbers, we can see that the overall training incidence and match incidence, as you can see on the top row, declined with about 3% each season on average. Whereas for muscle injuries, there was no difference in the incidence over these 18 years. And also when we look at the burden of injuries, that is the connection of time loss and frequency of injuries, we can see that muscle and ligament injuries are not declining. And particularly if we look at hamstring injuries, this was the study where we looked at injuries from start of the study in 2001 up till 2022. And particularly in the last 8 seasons, we can see that there's actually an increase in both the incidence and the burden of hamstring injuries. And this is true for training and for matches. So, despite our best efforts in elite football, it seems challenging to deal with these hamstring injuries. And this is not only in Europe. This is a study from the Asian Football Confederation Injury Surveillance Program with Montesar Taban and colleagues out of Aspetar. And when they looked at hamstring injuries in 3 seasons in their data cohort, they found very similar numbers. 17% of injuries are hamstring injuries, being the most common injury in this cohort, with an incidence of 0.9 and a burden of 17 injuries per 1,000 hours. So if we look at the risk matrix on the figure here to the right, we can see indeed that thigh injuries tend to be a big problem also in this cohort. Further, looking at the Qatari Stars League, Kamari and colleagues just presented this data. You seem to be doing something right here in terms of the overall incidence of injuries on the decline, but thigh injuries in risk matrix, as we can see in the figure here, are very prevalent and quite severe. And it's not only in football or soccer that we have this problem. So this meta-analysis was published last year in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, where they collated more than 60 studies. There were a bit of mixed level of play, but most of them were from professional level athletes. And the overall incidence of injuries was quite similar among these field-based team sports. Football at the top, and then maybe in Australian football far at the bottom, we see a little increase in injury rates. But importantly, the right figure, there was no decrease evident over time. So let's look at some of the risk factors for hamstring injuries. These systematic reviews have 10 years in the history books. There should be a new one out now, but they're still relevant. And what we can see is that previous injury is by far the most studied risk factor and is a strong risk factor for hamstring injury. Increased age is also associated with hamstring injuries, and lower strength. So let's have a look at these top 3 risk factors. This study came out of UT with Ryan Timmins and colleagues in the BJSM in 2016. And on these graphs, we can see the probability of a hamstring injury on the y-axis. And we can see that older players tend to have higher probability of a hamstring injury. But if you have a higher eccentric strength of the hamstrings, you seem to be able to reduce that risk. Similarly, if you had a previous hamstring injury, you were more likely to suffer a hamstring injury during the season. But when you have longer fascicle length of the biceps femoris long head, you can reduce these injuries. Now, another big problem is the recurrence of hamstring injuries. And we've seen in our data that for most muscle injuries, and I've highlighted the hamstring injuries here with the asterisks, 50% occur within the first month of return to play. And this study from Wangensten and colleague out of Aspetar showed very similar data. More than 50% of recurrences of hamstring injuries within the first 4 weeks of return to play. Very similar findings from the AFL, another football running cohort study. More than 50% of injuries here within the first 2 months. So it's really a challenge with the first return to play and keeping the players on the pitch for the first couple of weeks. Now, one thing that we were interested in was to see that we know that hamstring injuries are more prevalent during matches, and I will come back to that during my talk. Is there an association between when you return to play, when you're cleared to return to full practice from the medical staff, and the number of trainings you perform before you play that first game? And this was published by Håkan Bengtsson and colleagues some years ago. And here you can see the distribution of the number of training sessions that you had after you've had a moderate to severe injury and the return to play before you play your first game. Many will have 1, 2, or 3 training sessions, and some will have more. If we correlate this to the risk of having a muscle injury, so the average during a season when you play a game, there's a 1% risk of having a muscle injury in that game. That's the average for the whole season. If you have just returned from a moderate to severe injury, this risk doubles up to 2%. And if we look at the number of training sessions you've had before that first game, we can see a steady decline. So a 14% drop of injury likelihood for each additional training sessions you've had prior to that first game. It takes about 3 or 4 training sessions to come down to the level of average for the first game. It takes somewhere around 4 to 7 training sessions to come down to the average for the whole season. Now, this does not mean that we should always play it safe. Keep the player longer in rehabilitation, provide more training sessions before you have that first game. Because overall, you will have a longer or a larger loss of player availability if you keep them in rehab too long. So this has to be an individual decision, and it's a risk-reward decision that we make. What are the rewards for the player? What are the rewards for the team in terms of bringing a player back quicker? What are the risks involved in that decision? And of course, this is a well-known START framework where we balance the risks and reward in the return to play management. And let's look at some of the factors that might influence our decision, that influence absence and re-injury risk in terms of hamstring injuries. So if we look at tissue health, or the health risks involved in this decision, we can see that repeat injuries, if you have a player that has repeat injuries, tend to have a even higher injury risk and longer absence. If you have a stretching type injury versus a sprint type injury, these tend to have longer absence. If you have a structural injury as opposed to a functional injury, you can expect a longer absence and also a higher injury risk. If you have a high-grade injury versus a low-grade injury, and this may be based on whatever MRI clinical criteria that you want. If you have an injury that's proximal, closer to the tuberositas, ischial tuberosity, usually a longer absence If you have an injury that involves the connective tissue versus more the contractile tissue, you can expect a longer absence and probably also a greater injury risk. And if you have involvement of the proximal free tendon or the intramuscular tendon, this is usually involved longer absence from play. So what about tissue stresses or the activity-related risks that we might consider? Well, playing position. If you're a field player, you tend to have higher injury risk than a goalkeeper if you talk of football. Winger usually run more, sprint more, they will have a higher injury risk than central players typically. If you've done some clinical and functional tests and the player have failed them, this is associated with a higher injury risk. There's some evidence emerging now looking at sprint biomechanics, and this may also be considered in the return to play decision, and also psychological readiness. And now finally, if we look at some of the things that may modify our decision to return that athlete back to play, there's the time of the season and the timing of that injury and return to play. Is it a pre-season injury or is it an in-season injury? Are there some important games coming up so they have to get the player back quickly? There's pressures from the coach, from the managers, from the agents, and from the players themselves to return early. Another thing that is very relevant in elite sports, elite field-based sports, is match-related factors. And the coach usually asks, how often can I play her or him? This meta-analysis came last year in the BJSM, looking at, again, 60 studies. And we can see that the injury risk for hamstring injury is 10 times higher during games than during training. So this is very much a game problem in most field-based sports. And interestingly, when we look at the Champions League data, we see very similar numbers. The ratio between incidence in match and training is 10-1. And also, injury recurrences are much more likely to occur during games than during training. We have looked a little bit about when during games muscle injuries occur, and we can see consistently for hamstrings, adductors, quads, calf injuries, they tend to be more common towards the end of each half. So fatigue might be another component to consider during the game and between games. So looking at some of the data on team level, does it matter if you play 2 games per week, 1 game per week? And our data suggests yes. So when you play 2 games per week, the overall injury rate goes up with 9%, particularly for muscle injuries. We see a 30% increase in injury rates. As a team, if you have a big roster of qualified players, you can always try to rotate players in between games, and this is usually done. This is more difficult if you don't have a competitive squad with 20 or 25 players, as some of the bigger teams do. And if we look at the same numbers at player level, we can see that players, again, who play 2 matches per week as opposed to 1 match per week, will have a 20% higher injury risk. So what do we know about how these hamstring injuries occur? If we look at the Champions League data, and this is based on club reports, so club medical staff report of the mechanisms of hamstring injuries, we can see that almost exclusively we have non-contact injuries. 97% of the hamstring injuries are non-contact. And these are the specific mechanisms that we see. As confirmed by previous research, we can see that running injuries is the most common mechanism, more than 60% of all injuries. Stretching represents 5% of all injuries. Other acute mechanisms, and this also includes shooting and passing, together 10% of all injuries. And we have 12% with a gradual onset. We can see that structural injuries tend to be more biased towards running mechanisms, functional injuries more biased towards gradual onset. As for the biceps fem and the semitendinosus and membranosus injuries, we can see a larger proportion of running injuries among biceps femoris injuries and a higher proportion of stretching injuries among the semi-T and semimembranosus injuries. And this goes back to the original work by Kalle Askling, who showed the same thing. Now, there has been some emerging data coming out of video analysis studies. This has been done for some time on more traumatic injuries, acute knee injuries, for instance. But for the last couple of years, we've seen the same video analysis studies of games and also looking at muscle injuries and hamstring injuries. And this provides very important information about the mechanism based on objective data. And as we can see here from the study of Gronwald and colleagues, they found a similar distribution of running injuries and stretch-related injuries, which doesn't really concur with the numbers that I showed you before. Sprint-related and particularly acceleration phase injuries were very common. So it might not only be that high-speed running, but particularly the acceleration phase that is problematic. They saw that closed-chain lunging, closed-chain mechanism of stretch injury, was the most common injury, as we see on the bottom figure here. Now, similarly, Francesca Della Villa and colleagues showed in 61 male players running 40% of all injuries. Open chain stretching and closed chain stretching accounted for 45%, almost 50% of all injuries. So again, the stretch mechanism was in fact more common in these studies than the running mechanism. And Della Villa and colleagues also looked at comparing male and female elite football, 60 cases among the males and 30 among the women. And we can see a higher proportion of indirect contact injuries, so there's some kind of a disturbance to the player at the injury situation among females, more running injuries among the females, and a higher proportion of kick-in injuries, whilst the overstretching type injury seemed to be more common in male players. Now this study coming out of Aspetar, Vermeulen and colleagues looked at the Qatari Stars League and found that running was indeed the most common mechanism, similar to the UEFA database. But again, it might not be particularly the high-speed running that is most problematic. Acceleration injuries, and particularly short acceleration below 10 meters, were quite common. Running with a change of direction, as we do in football, were another problematic scenario. And also, this is very interesting in my reflection, is that they found that a pressing situation, and mainly in the defending pressing situation, where you have inadequate balance, you may have some kind of perturbation with an indirect contact or a cognitive perturbation, very similar to ACL injuries, seem to be a common mechanism. So let's go into prevention. What evidence do we have for prevention? And I can bet that most of you will think of this. And rightly so, I must say. If you look at the evidence we have on exercise interventions to reduce hamstring injuries, this systematic review from professional and semi-professional football by Biss and colleagues, where they looked at FIFA 11 Plus that contains Nordic hamstring exercise, and 2 studies that look particularly at the Nordic hamstring exercise program, found a more than 50% risk reduction if you use these exercise interventions compared to controls. Lasse Ishøy and colleagues from the Danish Sports Physical Therapy Association looked similarly. They included 3 meta-analyses, 12 RCTs, mixed level of play, again between 40 to 60% risk reduction if you use an exercise-based intervention. And this study is well known here for most of us. Systematic review by Van Dijk and colleagues, looking particularly at Nordic hamstring exercise, found a 50% risk reduction when you use this program. So we seem to have the solution. Why don't we see a reduction in injuries? Well, one obvious reason: clubs don't use it. So Roald and colleagues found in the Champions League teams and among Norwegian top-level teams that only 17% of clubs use it fully or to some extent, 80% non-compliant. Mainly, players don't like the program, muscle soreness. Similar data from England, 17% used the program of clubs, 80% did not. Muscle soreness, players dislike. US soccer, 20% use it fully. More clubs use it partially. Still, the complaints, players dislike, causes soreness. So there's some challenges mainly to implementing these programs at the top level. Now, considering that we see that sprinting is a very important mechanism for injuries, there's some emerging evidence looking at sprinting as a vaccine for hamstring injuries. And if we typically have looked at exercise interventions that aim to strengthen the capacity of the hamstrings, they've looked more into how can we modulate that load on the hamstrings with running technique, for instance. So this is some figures coming out of Brahma and colleagues from sports medicine this year, but it relates most to the works done by Edouard and Mendiguccia and Morin and Lahti and colleagues. And what they suggested we can have a look at in terms of running biomechanics is looking at the control, lumbar and pelvic and trunk control. We can look at the stride length, for instance, and perhaps about backside biomechanics, posterior chain biomechanics. Now, the evidence is still emerging here, but this seems to be an interesting field where we can have some new research. Another thing we have to consider is this. What about development of the game? So this is a Champions League final in 2002, when we first started the study, and from last year, 2024. And you might say it's all the same. We have Real Madrid on one side and a German team on the other side, and Real Madrid wins. But if we look at the development from Zidane to Vinny Jr., there's quite a lot happening. And this data come from English professional football, and actually 10 years old though. But they saw an increase, 30 to 35% of high-intensity running and sprinting. And this will, of course, impact muscle injury risk. And it's not only the game itself, it's the whole situation in elite football, where you have practices that are more match-like, involve sprinting and high-intensity activities. The clubs and the players are exposed to a crowded match calendar. You have year-round schedules, very little time for breaks and recovery, mentally and physically. So we have to consider that risk factors are multifactorial. Our prevention emphasis should also be multifactorial. And building on the work by Buckthorpe and colleagues, hamstring strengthening, of course, has to be part of that prevention puzzle, but also looking at the load of players, how we rehabilitate and manage injuries, the general conditioning of players, the well-being factors, and some club factors. And this work comes out of Aspetar, where they use this risk management model. And you have to engage the clubs, all of the key stakeholders. And this table here shows examples of prioritized interventions among elite clubs here in the Qatari Stars League. Of course, on top, we see the Nordic hamstring exercise. But First place, communication. And this is very interesting and leads me on to my final chapter of this talk. When we look at elite sports, we have to consider the context. What are the club and the coach factors that might influence injury risk? Now this systematic review or scoping review by Salcinovic et al., Paul was also involved in this, I found very interesting. What are the factors that are related to success in big organizations, and how can we use that information to the high sport performance environment? And of course, we as a medical team has to function in the whole system or organization with coaches and managers, strength and conditioning coaches, well-being staff, sports scientists, and so on. And they found that leadership styles, supportive behaviors in the organization, communication are success factors. And we tried to learn more from this. And we asked all of the medical staff among the Champions League clubs, what factors do you perceive as important in trying to reduce hamstring injuries? And as you can see on top, lack of communication between the medical staff and coaches, mostly external factors from the athlete and from what we can do as a medical team. We talked to the women's medical staff, the same thing. Communication comes out on top. So indeed, we have to work with strengthening their players, but it's all about, working in that organization and the communication. So to finish off, we did a few studies where we looked at, for instance, leadership style among the teams. And this was as judged by the medical staffs of those clubs. So in seasons where they perceived that they had a good coach that had a positive leadership style, supported the organization, supported the staff, in those seasons they also had fewer injuries. If they perceived that the communication functioned well between the medical staff, the coaching staff, fitness coaching staff, in those seasons they had less problems with injuries. Now this is more ecological and observational studies, so there's no causality implied here, but it's very interesting to see these associations. Again, we were speaking about the difficulties of implementing the Nordic hamstring exercise. And indeed, we found poor adoption among the clubs, but some clubs do adopt this program. And when you have the coach support, when the coach supervises all parts of the training, including prevention training, it was easier for those teams to include these exercises. And what happens when you change a coach? Well, typically that coach will bring with them a new technical staff and a new fitness staff. And oftentimes that will change the loading and the physical training environment for these players, and we typically see an increase in muscle injuries. And also when you change medical staff. So we also have to think about our own influence when we come to a new club and trying to change things too much. And finally, some of the things are not really up to us, or maybe not even up to the coaches. The season scheduling, how does that influence injury rates? Well, we can see that a lot of the clubs, instead of building up the players during the preseason, they have to go on these promotional tours all around the world. And it's very difficult for them to have a long, sustainable practice preparation period prior to that season starts. Many of the clubs in Britain find challenges with not having a winter break, as you do in most of the other clubs in Europe. And indeed, what we see when we looked at this was that clubs in the UK tended to have longer absence from injuries in the second part of the season compared to the other leagues. So maybe that winter break provides an opportunity for some rest and recuperation among the players. Now, to summarize my talk, yes, hamstring injuries are indeed still a big problem in elite sports. The injury rate does not seem to be decreasing, but we also have to consider this in light of the development of the game. So maybe keeping a steady state on hamstring injuries is actually a good thing for us because of the higher exposures to high-risk activities and increasing demands of the game. The risk factors and mechanisms are multifactorial, so our prevention emphasis must also be multifactorial. We should aim for an individual risk management approach in the team and for individual players, and also secure the buy-in from coaches and players for our interventions. And at the elite environment, we should also consider club and coach factors and how that relates to injury risk. And we'll have to learn how to communicate, not only to colleagues and to players, but also to coaches, to managers, agents, and so on, to really perform well in this environment.